I remember the day they found her. I was only 10 years old, and it should have been one of the happiest times of my life. I had everything a child could ever dream of: wealth, luxury, and most importantly, a family. They had adopted me when I was just a baby, and for as long as I could remember, Mr. and Mrs. Matthews treated me like their own. I thought I was their daughter, and they were my parents. But that all changed when she came back. Is their long-lost daughter. It was a rainy afternoon when they got the call. I sat in the parlor, playing with my favorite doll, a gift from Mrs. Matthews on my 5th birthday, when I overheard them talking in hushed voices. There was something in their tone that unsettled me, but I couldn't quite figure it out. A few days later, they brought Eileen home. She was everything they had ever wanted: blonde, blue-eyed, with delicate features that mirrored Mrs. Matthews. I was different. Dark hair, olive skin, and sharp eyes that never quite matched their expectations. I didn't know it then, but Eileen's return would change my life forever. At first, they tried to balance their attention between us. But it wasn't long before the subtle differences became glaring. Eileen got the best dresses, the finest toys, and all the affection that had once been mine. I watched from the sidelines as my world slowly crumbled. One evening, when I was trying to read in the corner of the library, I heard them talking about me. "We can't just ignore her," Mr. Matthews said, his voice low but stern. "Lucy is still our responsibility." Mrs. Matthews sighed. "But she's not really ours, James. Now that Eileen is back, it's only right that we focus on her. She's our blood." I felt a lump form in my throat. I had heard similar conversations before, but this one stung differently. They were beginning to forget that I even existed. As time passed, Eileen made it her mission to remind me every day that I didn't belong. She would take my favorite things and claim them as her own: a ribbon I loved, a book I had cherished for years. When I confronted her, she would smile sweetly, her voice dripping with malice. "You don't need these," she'd say, her icy blue eyes narrowing. "You're not a real part of this family." I knew better than to argue. Every time I tried to defend myself, Eileen would run to our parents, tears streaming down her face, playing the victim. And of course, they always believed her. "You need to stop being so jealous, Lucy," Mrs. Matthews scolded me one day after Eileen had taken yet another one of my dresses. "Eileen is your sister. You should learn to share." Share? It was as if I had nothing left of my own to share. Everything that had once been mine was slowly slipping through my fingers, and no one cared. Not even Adrian. Adrian had been my closest friend for as long as I could remember. He lived in the small cottage on the edge of the estate, orphaned and alone, except for the kindness of our family, who took pity on him. I used to sneak him food and help him with his studies. We would talk for hours, laughing and dreaming of the future together, and I thought we'd always have that bond. Because he was my sweetheart. But things changed when Eileen returned. At first, Adrian stayed close, still visiting me in secret and promising we'd always be friends, and maybe we will have a future together. But soon, I noticed a shift. He started spending more time with Eileen, drawn to her beauty, her charm, and the wealth she represented. It wasn't long before he became one of her many admirers, following her around like a lost puppy. I confronted him one evening, my voice trembling with anger. "Why are you doing this, Adrian? She doesn't care about you, she's just using you." He looked away, guilt flickering in his eyes, but his words were cold. "You're wrong, Lucy. She's different. She's everything I've ever wanted." I felt my heart shatter in that moment. The boy I had once trusted with everything had chosen her. And from that day forward, Adrian treated me like I was nothing more than an inconvenience. By the time I turned 18, the Matthews had made it clear that I no longer had a place in their home. I had graduated from school with good grades, but no amount of academic success could change their minds. Eileen had secured her place as the golden child, and I was nothing more than a reminder of the time they had spent without their real daughter. The day they threw me out was one I would never forget. Mrs. Matthews stood at the door, her arms crossed, while Mr. Matthews handed me a small envelope, barely enough money to last a few weeks. "You're old enough to make your own way now," he said, avoiding my eyes. "It's time for you to go." I looked at them, searching for any sign of remorse, any hesitation. But there was none. Eileen stood behind them, a smug smile playing on her lips, and Adrian was nowhere to be seen. With a heavy heart, I packed my bags and left the only home I had ever known, unsure of where I would go or what I would do next. Life outside the Matthews mansion was harder than I had imagined. I spent the first few weeks living in a small, run-down apartment, struggling to find work. Every door I knocked on seemed to slam in my face, but I refused to give up. Eventually, I found a job as an assistant at a small marketing firm. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a start. I worked long hours, saving every penny I could while also taking night classes to further my education. It was exhausting, but it gave me purpose. I thought about Adrian often, wondering if he ever thought of me, if he regretted the way he had abandoned me. But I never reached out. I couldn't bear the thought of hearing his voice, knowing he had chosen Eileen over me. Over the next few years, I threw myself into my work and studies, slowly climbing the ranks at the marketing firm. My hard work paid off, and soon I had enough money to start my own business. It started small, a boutique marketing agency, but it quickly grew, and before I knew it, I was competing with some of the biggest names in the industry. That's when I heard the news. The Matthews family business was struggling, their once thriving empire crumbling under the weight of bad investments and poor management. Eileen, now engaged to Adrian, was trying to save it, but it was clear they were in over their heads. A plan began to form in my mind. I knew things about the Matthews business that could ruin them. I had overheard countless conversations about their shady dealings and unethical practices. And now, I had the power and resources to expose them. I still remember, the years I spent in the Matthews household were the darkest of my life. And at the center of that darkness stood Eileen. Her cruelty knew no bounds. From the moment she returned, she made it clear I didn't belong. It started small innocent pranks, at least that's how she painted them. A missing shoe here, a spoiled lunch there. But soon, her pranks turned more vicious. One day, I found my textbooks drenched in water, my notes for an important test ruined beyond repair. When I confronted her, she only smiled. "It's not my fault you leave your things lying around, Lucy. You really should be more careful." No matter what she did, Eileen was always the victim in our parents' eyes. And Adrian? He fell for her act completely. I remember one night after dinner, Eileen made a snide remark about how I never seemed to fit in, how no one could ever really love someone like me. I turned to Adrian, hoping he would defend me like he used to when we were kids. But instead, he laughed along with her. "Come on, Lucy," he said, shaking his head. "Don't take it so seriously. Eileen's just joking." A part of me died that night. Adrian, the one person I thought I could rely on, my crush, had turned against me. From that moment on, he was no longer the boy who shared my dreams and secrets. He had become someone else, someone who chose Eileen every single time. The betrayal stung more than I could have imagined. Adrian and I had been inseparable once. We grew up together, two lonely children in a world that seemed too big and too cruel. I had always admired him for his strength, his unwavering kindness, and the way he treated me with respect when no one else did. But that changed when Eileen sunk her claws into him. I remember watching them together, the way she played him like a puppet. Adrian hung on her every word, did whatever she asked, and it was clear that she enjoyed having power over him. She would glance at me with that sly, knowing smirk whenever he wasn't looking, as if to remind me that she had won. "Adrian," I asked him one evening as we sat on the porch, "why do you let her treat you like that? She doesn't care about you the way you think." He looked at me as if I had said something unforgivable. "You're just jealous, Lucy," he said, his voice colder than I'd ever heard it. "Eileen is different. She cares about me in ways you never could. I really like her." I was speechless. My heart felt like it had been torn in two, but all I could do was nod and walk away. From that moment on, Adrian was no longer my friend, my crush. He was just another part of Eileen's world, a world that I no longer belonged to. Remember that day, when I turned 18, I was an afterthought in the Matthews family. Eileen had successfully replaced me in every way. Our parents doted on her, showering her with love, gifts, and praise, while I was treated like a stranger in my own home. It came to a head on my 18th birthday. Instead of a celebration, I was handed an ultimatum. Mrs. Matthews pulled me aside that morning, her face stiff with forced politeness. "Lucy," she began, "you're an adult now. It's time for you to leave. We've done our duty raising you, but you don't belong here anymore." I was shocked, even though I had expected it. I stood frozen as she continued, "We've arranged for a small sum to help you get started. But it's time for you to go. Eileen is our daughter, and we need to focus on her future." That evening, I packed my few belongings in silence. Eileen didn't bother to hide her satisfaction. Adrian, now completely under her spell, avoided me entirely. The next morning, I left the mansion that had once been my home, knowing I would never be welcome there again. The years that followed were grueling. With nowhere to go, I rented a cramped studio apartments and took the first job I could find. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep me going. I spent my nights studying business, determined to build something of my own, to prove that I was more than just the girl they had thrown away. I didn't hear from the Matthews family for years. And frankly, I didn't want to. The pain of their rejection of Adrian's betrayal was too much to bear. But that pain fueled me. Every sleepless night, every grueling shift, was one step closer to my goal. I poured my energy into learning everything I could about business, eventually starting my own small marketing firm. It was a risk, but I was determined. And slowly, things began to turn around. My business grew, and so did my confidence. The girl who had been discarded by the only family she knew was gone, replaced by a woman who knew her worth. It was years later when I heard the news. The Matthews family business, once a symbol of wealth and power, was struggling. Poor investments, shady deals, and Eileen's incompetence had driven the company to the brink of collapse. It was poetic justice, really. And I knew exactly how to finish them. Through my connections and my past with them, I had learned the details of their business practices, illegal deals, tax fraud, and a network of lies that had kept them afloat for years. I knew exposing them would destroy their reputation. But that wasn't enough for me. I wanted them to feel the kind of helplessness I had felt when they cast me aside. And then there was Adrian. He was no longer just Eileen's admirer, he was her fiancé. He had fully embraced the wealth and status that came with being part of the Matthews family, forgetting all about the promises we had made as children, to have a family together. Instead, he's making the dream with Eileen. One evening, as I sat in my office overlooking the city, I made the decision to expose them. I gathered every piece of evidence I had against the Matthews family and sent it to the authorities. The fallout was swift and brutal. Their business empire crumbled overnight. Eileen's smug smile was wiped from her face as the media swarmed them, exposing their lies for the world to see. Adrian? He was caught in the middle. He had hitched his wagon to Eileen, believing that being her husband would secure his future. But when their wealth evaporated, so did Eileen's love for him. They began to fight constantly, the cracks in their perfect facade becoming impossible to ignore. I had heard whispers that the Matthews family was attending the same charity gala I'd been invited to. At first, I had planned to skip it altogether. After all, what reason did I have to walk into a room full of people who had discarded me like an old toy? But then I reconsidered. I wasn't the same girl they had thrown out years ago. No, I was stronger now. I had built my empire from the ground up, while they had squandered theirs. So, I dressed for the occasion, wearing a sleek, emerald green gown that hugged my figure perfectly. I wanted to make a statement. I wanted them to see me for who I had become, not the broken girl they had left behind, but the successful, self-made woman who now stood tall, unshakable. The venue was dazzling, chandeliers glittering above as high society figures mingled around with glasses of champagne in hand. As I entered the grand ballroom, heads turned, and I could feel the eyes of the crowd following me. Then I saw them. Eileen stood with our parents and Adrian, who looked visibly worn out. Their expensive attire couldn't mask the desperation that clung to them. I had heard about their financial troubles, about how they were now drowning in debt. And here they were, putting on a facade for the world, just as they had always done. Eileen was the first to notice me. Her eyes widened in shock, before quickly narrowing in contempt. I felt a smirk tug at my lips. This was going to be fun. Lucy? Eileen's voice was laced with false surprise as she approached me. What a surprise to see you here. I turned to face her, letting her words hang in the air for a moment. Surprise? I asked, raising an eyebrow. I suppose it is, for you. She blinked, clearly thrown off by my calm demeanor. The crowd around us seemed to sense the tension, and I noticed several pairs of eyes discreetly watching us. This was Eileen's domain where she thrived on belittling others. But she didn't know who she was dealing with now. Oh, it's just that, she began, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. I wasn't expecting to see you here. I thought this kind of event might be above you. A few people around us chuckled nervously, sensing the underlying insult. I could see Eileen's smirk growing, thinking she had landed a blow. But I wasn't the timid girl she used to taunt. I took a step closer to her, lowering my voice so only she could hear. You must have me confused with the girl you used to know, Eileen. The one you pushed around. The one you forgot about. But let me remind you, everything you've ever had, you didn't earn. You were handed your life on a silver platter, and you squandered it. Her eyes flickered with anger, but I didn't stop. Me? I continued, I built everything I have from the ground up. While you were busy ruining your family's business, I was building mine. So maybe, just maybe, you're the one who doesn't belong here. People around her began to whisper, oh my gosh, she didn't know? This is Miss Lucy, the CEO of a big company. LOL, the spoiled loser Eileen talking like that to a successful woman like Lucy, the owner her business. What a shameless girl. The color drained from her face, she looked shocked and horrified as the people nearby kept talking and looking down on her. We had struck a nerve. Me and the guests, and she knew it. Eileen's smug expression crumbled, but before she could muster a response, I turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, humiliated. Later that evening, as I was sipping champagne near the balcony, I felt a familiar presence behind me. Turning, I found Adrian standing there, his once charming smile replaced with an awkward, almost pleading look. Lucy, can we talk? He asked hesitantly. I stared at him for a moment before nodding, curious to see what he had to say. We stepped away from the crowd, finding a quiet corner of the ballroom. I know things weren't easy between us, Adrian began, fidgeting nervously. I made mistakes, and I regret what happened between us. I crossed my arms, waiting for him to get to the point. He avoided my gaze, rubbing the back of his neck in discomfort. Lucy, he finally said, we need your help. I couldn't help but laugh, the sound sharp and bitter. My help? I repeated. After everything you and your precious Eileen did to me, you think I'd help you? Adrian's face reddened with embarrassment. We're in trouble, Lucy, he admitted. The company is on the verge of bankruptcy. Eileen, she's not as good with the business as we thought she'd be. And my investments, well, they haven't been doing well either. I let his words sink in. So this was why he was here. Not because he truly regretted his actions, not because he missed me, but because he needed something from me. I felt a flicker of anger rising within me, but I kept my composure. You're telling me this, why? I asked, my voice icy. Because we need a loan, Adrian blurted out. We know you've done well for yourself, and, well, we were hoping you could help us get back on our feet. I stared at him in disbelief. You want me to bail you out? He had the nerve to look ashamed, but I could see the desperation in his eyes. Please, Lucy. We don't have anywhere else to turn. Before I could respond, I felt another presence nearby. Turning, I saw Mrs. Matthews approaching, her face pale and worried. Behind her, Mr. Matthews stood silently, his expression hardened by years of failure. Lucy, Mrs. Matthews said softly, we made mistakes. We didn't treat you the way we should have. But you have to understand, we were trying to do what was best for Eileen. She's our real daughter. I clenched my fists at her words, the familiar sting of rejection flooding back. So I was just a placeholder, I said, my voice trembling with anger. Someone to fill the void until you found your real daughter? Mrs. Matthews shifted uncomfortably, but Mr. Matthews stepped forward. We were wrong, Lucy, he said, his voice gruff. But we're asking for your forgiveness. We need your help. I stared at them, at the people who had once been my family, now reduced to begging me for help. There was a part of me, deep down, that had longed for this moment. The moment when they would realize the consequences of their actions, when they would see how much they had hurt me. And now that it was here, I felt nothing but cold satisfaction. No, I said finally, my voice firm. Adrian's eyes widened in disbelief. What? But. I'm not your savior, I cut him off, my tone sharp. I'm not going to rescue you from the mess you created. You threw me away, all of you. And now you expect me to bail you out? You think you can use me again? I could see the shock on their faces, the realization that I wasn't going to play their game. You're on your own, I said, turning to leave. But then, I paused, glancing back at them one last time. Consider this payback for all the years you made me feel like I was nothing. With that, I walked away, leaving them standing there, humiliated and desperate. They had come to me for help, but I had given them exactly what they deserved: nothing. The fallout from the Matthews family's collapse was swift and brutal. Eileen, once the queen of high society, was now a laughingstock. The media had latched onto the story of their financial ruin, and soon, everyone knew how their empire had crumbled. Eileen's so-called friends abandoned her, and she found herself isolated, just as I had been all those years ago. Adrian, who had once been so proud to stand by Eileen's side, now faced the consequences of his choices. His wealth, his status, everything he had built with the Matthews family, was gone. And as for their engagement? It didn't last long. Eileen blamed him for their downfall, and their relationship quickly dissolved into bitter arguments and accusations. In the end, they were left with nothing, as I had been. Bankruptcy is their new reality. As for me, I thrived. My business continued to grow, and I finally found peace in knowing that I had taken back control of my life. The Matthews family was a distant memory now, a chapter one had closed for good. Every so often, I would hear whispers about them: how Eileen struggled to find work to help the business, how Adrian had tried to move away, trying to start over. But Eileen didn't let him. It wasn't long before they came to me again. I should have expected it. Desperate times called for desperate measures, and with nowhere else to turn, they thought I might be their last hope. One evening, as I sat in my office reviewing some documents for a new project, I received a call. It was Adrian. Lucy, please, just hear me out, his voice cracked through the phone. I was tempted to hang up. Every part of me wanted to end the call right there, but curiosity got the better of me. So, I listened. Things are bad, Lucy. Worse than before, he admitted. Eileen and I, we're almost done. And the Matthews, they've lost everything. I said nothing, waiting for him to get to the point. We need help, he finally confessed. My future parents-in-law, they don't know what else to do. They're losing the house. They don't even have enough to cover basic expenses. I'm asking for your help. I leaned back in my chair, letting his words sink in. Adrian had always been proud, always too self-assured, but now, he was groveling. The satisfaction I felt in that moment was almost overwhelming. No, I said coldly. I'm not your savior. Not then, and certainly not now. "But Lucy, we're family," he pleaded, his voice growing more desperate. "Family?" I repeated, my tone sharp. "You threw me away, all of you. You chose your precious Eileen over me, over everything. You left me with nothing. And now you expect me to rescue you?" I could hear him struggling to respond, but I wasn't finished. "You didn't care about me when I needed you most," I continued, my voice firm. "Now it's your turn to feel what that's like." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and then I heard Adrian sigh in defeat. "I'm sorry, Lucy," he whispered. But his apology meant nothing to me anymore. It was too late. Eileen had always been the golden child, even before they found her. She was the perfect image of what a daughter should be, at least in the eyes of Mr. and Mrs. Matthews. She had the beauty, the grace, and the charm to manipulate everyone around her. But after the Matthews family's financial collapse, it didn't take long for Eileen's world to crumble as well. The people who had once adored her, who attended her lavish parties and praised her for being the epitome of wealth and class, turned their backs the moment her fortune disappeared. Invitations stopped arriving, her so-called friends stopped answering her calls, and soon, the glittering world she had once commanded had shut its doors on her. Eileen, who had thrived on attention, found herself alone and irrelevant. Desperation set in quickly. I heard through the grapevine that she had tried to find a job, something simple at first, like managing a boutique. But it wasn't long before word spread about the shady business dealings that had destroyed her family's reputation. No one wanted to associate with her, let alone hire her. Eileen's pride, which had always been her armor, became her downfall. She was too proud to take a lower-paying job, too humiliated to ask for real help. At one point, I heard she had tried to reconnect with some of the friends she had betrayed during her rise to social prominence, people she had mocked or discarded when she no longer needed them. But doors that she had once slammed shut remained locked in her face. People loved to see the once powerful fall, and Eileen's descent was the talk of the town. As for Adrian, I never expected him to rise from the ashes, but I certainly didn't think his life would take such a sharp downward turn. After I refused to help him at the gala, his engagement to Eileen deteriorated rapidly. They began to argue constantly. Eileen blamed him for the Matthews family's collapse, claiming that his poor investments had led to their financial ruin. Adrian, in turn, accused her of being too reckless with the business, of failing to maintain what little control they had left. Their once perfect relationship became toxic, filled with shouting matches and silent treatments. Adrian, who had once been the charming boy I thought I loved, had now become bitter and resentful. The weight of his failures and Eileen's constant berating took a toll on him, and eventually, they ended their engagement in an explosive fight that left them both humiliated. But Adrian's fall didn't stop there. With no job, no money, and no prospects, he returned to the life he had once known, desperate and struggling. I heard that he tried to start a small business of his own, but with his tarnished reputation, no one wanted to work with him. Investors turned their backs, and within months, his new venture crumbled. Adrian, who had once been my closest friend, who had abandoned me for the glittering promise of wealth and status, was now worse off than ever before. In a cruel twist of fate, he found himself begging for handouts, living in a rundown apartment far from the life of luxury he had grown accustomed to. My adoptive parents, Mr. and Mrs. Matthews, didn't fare much better. The once proud owners of a thriving business empire, they were now the subject of gossip and ridicule. Their company had been their legacy, the very thing they believed would secure their place in society. But once the truth about their corrupt practices came to light, it all fell apart. They had lied, cheated, and stolen their way to success, and now the world knew it. Lawsuits piled up, their debts grew larger, and soon, they were forced to sell off everything they had: homes, cars, even family heirlooms. The mighty Matthews name had been dragged through the mud, and no one wanted anything to do with them anymore. They lost their mansion, the symbol of their wealth and power, and were forced to move into a modest house on the outskirts of town. For people who had once lived in the lap of luxury, this was the ultimate humiliation. My adoptive father, once a man who commanded boardrooms with his presence, became a shell of his former self. He aged rapidly, the stress of losing everything weighing heavily on him. I heard he had tried to reach out to old business associates, but just like Adrian, no one wanted to be associated with the Matthews name. As for Mrs. Matthews, she retreated from public life altogether. Once the queen of social circles, she now avoided any and all public events, too ashamed to show her face in the same circles where she had once reigned supreme. The friends she had once charmed were long gone, and she spent her days in isolation, haunted by the life she had lost. I never saw or heard from them again after that. The Matthews family faded into obscurity, their empire reduced to rubble. Eileen, the golden child, was now nothing more than a shadow of her former self, struggling to survive in a world that had no place for her. Adrian, the boy I had once loved, was just another casualty of his own greed. As for Mr. and Mrs. Matthews, they lived out the rest of their days in quiet shame, far from the luxurious life they had once known. The world forgot about them, just as they had forgotten about me. I had won. I had built my life, my success, without any of them. And in the end, that was the greatest revenge of all. Years passed, and I had built not only an empire but a life filled with peace and happiness, a stark contrast to the torment I had once endured under the Matthews roof. My success was something I had worked hard for, every penny earned through my grit and determination. But beyond wealth, I had found something far more precious: love and family. I met Michael at one of my company's charity galas. He was everything I never thought I would find in a man: kind, thoughtful, and honest. He didn't care about my past or the scars I carried, he admired my strength and ambition. Michael was a self-made man, just like me, having built his wealth through years of hard work in the real estate industry. He understood my drive and my pain in ways that no one else could. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I had someone who truly saw me. Our relationship blossomed quickly, and within a year, we were married. It wasn't the flashy, over-the-top affair that Eileen would have dreamed of. Instead, it was intimate and elegant, just close friends and family. As I stood at the altar with Michael, I couldn't help but think back to all the pain I had endured, how far I had come. And now, here I was, marrying a man who loved me for me, not for my wealth or what I could give him. I had finally found my happily ever after. A year after our wedding, Michael and I welcomed our first child, a beautiful baby boy we named Ethan. The moment I held him in my arms, all the heartache of the past seemed to melt away. I had spent so many years feeling unloved, unwanted, and discarded, but now I had my own little family, a family built on love, not deceit. Ethan was everything to me. I vowed that I would give him the childhood I had always longed for, one filled with care, warmth, and guidance. But there was more to my dream of having a family. I had always felt a deep connection to children in need, perhaps because I had once been that child, a girl adopted only to be tossed aside. I knew that somewhere out there were children who needed a second chance, just like I once did. One day, while Michael and I were visiting a local orphanage for one of my charity events, I saw her, a little girl standing alone in the corner, her eyes wide and filled with a mix of fear and sadness. She reminded me so much of myself at that age, quiet and uncertain of her place in the world. Her name was Emily, and she had lost both of her parents in a car accident when she was only 2. She had been at the orphanage for 2 years, with no family coming forward to take her in. I couldn't ignore the pull I felt toward her. I remembered what it was like to feel abandoned, to feel like no one cared. And I knew, in that moment, that I wanted to give her a home. After months of paperwork and visits, Emily officially became part of our family. Michael and I adopted her, and she took to life with us with ease. It was as though she had always belonged with us. Ethan adored her from the start, and I watched with pride as the two of them formed a bond as siblings. Emily had once been an orphan, like me, but now she had a family, a real family. As I looked at my children playing together in the garden one afternoon, I realized how complete my life had become. I had built a successful business, found love in Michael, and had the family I had always dreamed of. I had gone from being the neglected child tossed aside by the Matthews to a woman who had everything I had ever wanted. In many ways, my journey had come full circle. I had been adopted once out of pity, only to be discarded when I was no longer needed. But now, I had adopted Emily out of love, giving her the life I had always hoped someone would give me. And as for Ethan, my precious son, I knew that he would grow up surrounded by love, never knowing the cold indifference I had endured as a child. The past no longer had power over me. The Matthews family, Adrian, Eileen, they were all distant memories, shadows from a time when I had been weak and powerless. Now, I was strong, and I had risen above everything they had done to me. I had built something better, something real. I refused to be defined by their cruelty, by their betrayal. Instead, I was defined by my strength, by my ability to overcome. And as I held Michael's hand and watched our children play, I knew that this was my true victory. Not the wealth, not the power, but the love I had created. Eileen, Adrian, and my adoptive parents had all faded into obscurity, each of them suffering the consequences of their own greed and deceit. Eileen never recovered from the humiliation of her fall, her once glamorous life reduced to a pitiful existence. Adrian, too, struggled with his regrets, his search for wealth leaving him with nothing. And as for my adoptive parents, they spent their last years in shame and isolation, their legacy destroyed by their own hands. But I didn't need their downfall to feel victorious. My greatest victory was the life I had built, a life filled with love, joy, and family. And that, more than anything, was the ultimate revenge.